Blender is a 3D software unlike any other and allows you to do hundreds of different things. Whether that's remaking a scene from your favorite game, simply becoming good enough to find a job, or animating a character for personal use, whatever it may be, I like to share useful tips that can help you on your Blender journey. So if that sounds interesting to you, this is episode number 5 of Things You Can Do in Blender. Have you ever wanted to combine your 3D models with real footage in Blender? Here's how to do it. In a Blender scene with the object you want to integrate entered, add in a camera. Go to Constraints and add a Track to constraint and set your object to be the target. Now, with the camera selected, go to the Object Data Properties, enable Background Images, and open up the image you want to use as the background. Set the opacity to 1, and at this point, we need to start aligning the camera. Because the camera used a certain focal point, it's important to mimic this as best as possible. If you used a DSLR camera for shooting this photo, a lot of the data gets transferred over, and you can find this in the details for the image. For example, this is the focal point and this is the depth of field f-stops. In Blender, select the camera and copy the focal length. Now it's the moment where we need to align to the grid. At this point, you want to rotate your camera, and because you have the Track to constraint, it should rotate pretty easily, and I think this is pretty decent. Once you're happy, go to the constraint and press Ctrl A while hovering over it to apply all of these settings to the camera, and this is now permanent rotation and location data. You can always zoom in more and change the way things look after, but don't change the rotation anymore. You can also check this by moving your object along the X and Y axis, and you'll see that it usually aligns pretty well with wherever your ground plane is. And I'm gonna add in a plane. This plane should be below the character and slightly scaled up. You can also see that this plane is now properly aligning with the desk as well. Let's go into rendered view and let's add in a light to mimic the way this window behaves. I'm gonna add in an area light, but it's somewhere over here. Have it shine towards our character here, scale it up, and give it a lot more strength. Next up, we want the environment lighting to be the same color as the environment in this photo. So in the world properties, go over to color, select it, and select one of the colors that's pretty dominant in this image. As you can see, in a lot of these areas where there's bounce lighting, a slightly bluish tone is not uncommon. So I'm just going to select this color in the image here and set the strength to be about 0.5. Now select your plane, go to the object properties, into visibility, and enable shadow catcher. This will already do a little bit of something, but as you can see, we can still not see the actual desk below this. At this point, go to the render properties, down to film, and make sure you enable transparent. And now we actually get a perfect shadow from our character, which is aligning with our desktop here. This is already looking amazing, but we can make it look even better by doing a few more things. We want to create some more bounce lighting that actually mimics the way this image looks. So we're going to take this plane here, take the edge which is furthest from our camera, extrude it upwards, and move it a little bit to the back. Let's take this over to shading, and in this case create a material for this ground plane. So hit Ctrl T, which is a node wrangler shortcut, and open up the image that you already entered in Blender. We want to change our texture coordinate from UV to window. Now it seems like this doesn't do anything, but if you disable the shadow catcher, you can see that the image is now perfectly aligned with the image in the background of our camera here. The only thing we need to change is this principled BSDF, which should be removed and replaced with a diffuse BSDF so we don't get any weird artifacts or shading things. Just enable shadow catcher next and transparent. If you then hit render, you'll see that you only get the character. To have everything then work in compositing, use the following node setup to combine your footage with your 3D model. Now let's see the final result.
Nice.
The free built-in tissue add-on is one of the most powerful ones Blender has to offer. So go to Preferences, Add-ons, look up Tissue, and enable the add-on. It's one of the most versatile add-ons that Blender has, and I've created some great examples to showcase what you can do with it. The first is a face with several subdivisions, and what this will do is it will distribute this geometry over here, it's just some random geometry that I made, across all of these faces here. Select the geometry, shift select the face, and hit Tessellate. Now click OK, and it automatically distributes all these things across all of the faces. If we now go to the object data properties, there's this tissue tessellate tab. Now we can, for example, use tries or fans to create some really cool patterns as well. This is one option, and the cool thing is this is completely non-destructive, because if I take this face and I edit it, for example, I can then go back to our tessellation here, and I can change this, and there you go. Completely respects the new geometry. Here's a slightly more advanced example. So this is a basket weave pattern that I made, and this is our basket. Again, I can take this pattern, then select the basket over here and just hit tessellate, and now you can see we have a perfectly woven basket. The final example is for clothing. So if we take this spike here, we select our garment and we hit tessellate, okay, we'll get all of these cones everywhere. What's even better is we can specify where we want these. So let's just hide our tessellation here, select our object, and let's select some faces. For example, this shoulder bit would be a cool part to have these spikes on. Tap out of edit mode, select our tessellation object. In the selective tab, we can click on selected faces. This will make sure the spikes only appear wherever we had selected faces on our original mesh, which is a great way to add some little details like scales or spikes, horns, whatever you want on clothing, garments, or other objects. If you ever have a high density piece of geometry that you want to stick to a surface perfectly, this is the way to go about it. So in this scenario, I have a high density mesh object, which I want to stick to this curved panel in the back here. In this case, the process is fairly straightforward, but it's not what you might think. Usually people would go and add in a shrink wrap modifier, select that as the target, and then it starts moving all the vertices to the target. Now, as you can see, this creates quite a mess because it just flattens everything, and that's not the result that we're going for. Instead, what we need to do is we go Shift A and add in a lattice object. Let's go into front view here and scale up the lattice to be, slightly bigger than the high density geometry that we have here. Now, open up the lattice menu, which is part of the object data properties on the right side, and let's specify the amount of resolution that we need. Usually something like 10 by 10 works. So we can just go and fill in 10 for everything now, but we don't want all this geometry on the y-axis. So in this case, the V-axis, I'm not sure why they renamed them for this lattice modifier, can be just 1. Now let's align this to the back of our object like so. And at this point, we select the high density geometry, the lattice, hit Ctrl P to parent and set it to object keep transform. Now select the high density geometry, go into modifiers and add in a lattice modifier. Set the lattice as the target. From this point on, if we edit that, we should see deformation happening on our high density geometry mesh. Next, we want to stick the lattice to the panel. And in this case, we are using a shrink wrap modifier because it now doesn't matter if it flattens out. So add in a shrink wrap modifier, set the target to be the panel, and immediately you'll see we now have deformed our high density geometry to stick to the panel. In this case, using both the target normal project option is a very valid option where you sometimes do need to change the scaling to properly match the geometry after moving your lattice. Another option would be to use the project function, in which you need to specify the correct axis. In this case, it would be the Y one, and you can then move your geometry anywhere as well. It can create some issues when you move off too far to the back though. Having said that, you have now created an easy way to deform high density geometry, which will now respect its original look and still wrap perfectly around basically any object in Blender, as long as you have enough resolution on your lattice. Being a 3D artist is a job that relies heavily on time management, beating procrastination, and organizing all the tasks you have to do. And just like a ton of other creatives, I'm notoriously bad at doing these things. So a while back, I took a class on maximizing my productivity and organization through a free tool called Notion. This class by YouTube legend Ali Abdaal has helped me understand and use Notion to my benefit, where I'm now basically able to run my entire business through my Notion hub. I actually found this class over on Skillshare, the sponsor of this video, and it has helped me be more productive even in just organizing my Blender projects. If you're not like me and you've got your professional life on the tracks, Skillshare not only offers thousands of classes on whatever topic you may like, but it also has over 600 Blender classes available. Even better, they just launched a Learning Path series for Blender with Derek Elliott, which will help take you from complete beginner to making your first professional product animations. And when you're done with that, there's also learning paths for photography, graphic design, setting up a business, marketing, and tons of other skills that you might want to learn. So whether you just want to watch hours of Blender classes or need to streamline your day-to-day tasks, Skillshare has got you covered because they just hooked me up with an awesome offer for you. The first 500 people to use the link below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Now that sounds like a lot, but these do tend to go out quickly though, so make sure to get your free month while you can. If you're doing products in Blender, one of the most important things you can add to get a realistic look is anisotropic metal or brushed metal looks. And it's actually really simple to do using Blender's new principled BSDF node in 4.0 and up. Add in a new material, set the base color to be medium gray, make it fully metallic, and set the roughness to 0.1. Open up the specular tab and set anisotropic to be 1. Now let's add in a tangent node and plug that into the tangent of the specular tab. This will let you set the direction for the anisotropic rotation, and I like to leave it on Z for this object in particular. As you can see, changing the anisotropic rotation changes the way the light behaves. For the brush look, let's add in a bump node, connect that to the normal of the principled BSDF, add a noise texture, plug that into the height, set the scale to be a large number like 200, set the distance to 0.0001 and set the strength to 0.2. Now take a vector math node, set it to distance, connect that to the vector of the noise texture, and take a texture coordinate node and use generated coordinates to plug into the distance value. Now set all the values to 0.5, and there you have it. You now get the perfect brushed metal look inside of Blender. So make sure to add this material into your product renders to spice it up and take it to a higher level than it was before. There's two ways to create pipes in Blender. The first is by using a cylinder. You can just extend a cylinder like this, extrude it, but once we get to corners, things become a little more tedious. What I used to do is I would extrude, rotate, and in this way sort of create the bend that I needed for the pipes. Now I just found out there's a way easier way of doing this. If we just select this face still and we use the spin tool here, we can rotate this face. By shift clicking on all the X's, we can make sure that we can use all of these. Now, if we just rotate, you'll see that it's rotating. However, it's using our 3D cursor in the middle here as the pivot point. So we need to move this by shift right clicking somewhere on your grid, and now this will work a lot better. You can hold Control to make sure that it snaps to the grid and get that perfect 90-degree or 180-degree angle. Again, extruding, align to grid, move 3D cursor, and repeat. This way we can very easily create pipe shapes which we can use in our project. Method number 2 is completely different. This relies on using an actual single vertex. You can add them in if you have the extra mesh add objects, and we can extrude this single vert along any axis that we want, again creating a basic shape for our pipe model here. We can then hit A to select everything, Ctrl+Shift+B to bevel vertices, and then scroll wheel up to generate the bend that we want. Now with the line created, hit F3, type in curve, and object convert to curve. This is now a curve, and we can go to the object data properties to generate the mesh. In this geometry tab, enable the bevel and give it a depth. There's one small problem though if you want to change how the pipe looks, because you can no longer bevel these points very easily, and it will create weird shapes when you start extruding these. Instead, what you need to do is disable the bevel again, tap out of edit mode, F3, and in this case type in mesh. Now you can convert it back to a mesh and repeat all the steps that you did before. Glass dispersion is one of those things that looks very cool in 3D and is very heavily used in these types of stylized glass renders you see online. Now it's actually not that hard to do, and it only requires 9 nodes to create this material. So let's open up a shading window, create a new material for our object here, remove the principled BSDF, and create the glass dispersion shader. We're going to start out by using a mix shader and plugging that into the material output. The bottom input of this mix shader will be a glass BSDF with the proper IOR of 1.5, and the roughness can be 0.1 just because it looks slightly better than using a fully reflective glass material. If we now set the factor of the mix shader to 1, we can see our glass material is here. The top shader in this mix shader will be a combination of multiple refraction BSDFs. So let's add in a refraction BSDF and duplicate it 2 times. These refraction nodes will serve as the refraction for each individual color, which happens when light passes through glass and disperses. To combine these 3 refraction nodes, we're going to use add shaders. So select the top node, take the BSDF output, click and drag, and add a add shader node. Combine it with the middle refraction BSDF and combine with the bottom refraction BSDF. Now take this final add shader output and plug this into the mix shader. For the colors, we're going to use 3 different colors or RGB values. So click on the color, go to RGB, and in this case, let's start with red, so disable the green and blue. Let's now do the same for the green and blue values. Now currently we're not seeing the refraction BSDF at all because our mix shader is set to 1. Set it to 0 to see the refraction values. This is now black because it's outputting the red, green, and blue channel on the same IOR values. I like to start by taking the middle value and putting in the correct glass IOR of 1.5. Then we can take the red one and set it to 1.4 or 0.1 less, which immediately will start creating this cool dispersion effect. If we then take our blue value and set it to 1.6, we now get all three colors separated into different refraction values, creating this cool look. Now we need to combine this with the glass shader using a factor that works. Instead of using a manual value, we're going to use a Fresnel node and a color ramp. So let's take a Fresnel node and use this as the IOR to drive the factor. Again, we can set this to 1.5 for the proper glass IOR. And finally, we can take a color ramp to dial in these values and make it slightly more interesting to look at. I think something like this usually works pretty well, but it's up to you to decide on the final values. And there we have our final glass dispersion material. There's one thing to note here: light and the environment are very important for the final result. In this case, I have a sphere in this scene, which is covering our object here and has a black material, but it's set to be invisible to the camera, so it only shows up as reflections to this object. And I also have two area lights with very bright white values, making sure our object is well lit. Finally, the background is also white, and we can change this value to further decrease or increase the look of this scene. This basic shader setup will do a lot of the work for you and is pretty much good enough in a lot of situations. Now, like probably many of you, I used to model stairs like this. First of all, I took a cube, placed it where it needed to be, made sure it had roughly the right size, and at this point I would add in loop cuts, take the segments, Alt-E to extrude manifold, and extrude these down individually until it started looking something like a stair, which was quite annoying to do and a very manual process. Now, I've recently learned there's a way easier way of doing this involving the bevel tool. Select the edge to bevel, hit Ctrl B, and left click to confirm. Now open up the bevel menu at the bottom left here and change the width type from offset to depth. Now, instead of using the super ellipse profile type, we'll use the custom profile type. In here, you'll find several presets, including steps. So make sure to use steps and increase the segments until the steps pop up and work. You shouldn't see any of these interior lines, as you've probably gone too far at that point. Now we can change the width value here to generate the steps that we want. If at some point we want more steps, we can always increase the segments, then reset our preset to default, and then go back to steps to get more steps. Now this is a very quick and easy way to generate steps for basically any model you're working on. When you're modeling, it's not uncommon for you to need to create a hole in a model. So here's various different shapes ranging from simple to complex and how to create holes in them. Number one is a plane, which if we just subdivide it several times, we can go into face select a bunch of faces, and create a hole out of these. To do that, we'll need an add-on called Loop Tools. So go into Preferences, Add-ons, and make sure to look up Loop Tools and enable that. Now we can just right click on these selected faces, go to Loop Tools and choose Circle. If we then remove these faces, take all the other ones and extrude it, we now get a perfectly circular hole inside of a square-like shape. Our second example is a more complex shape with a curved UV sphere surface. In this case, if we go into front view, into wireframe, we can select a couple of faces like this, which will automatically select them on both sides. Again, right click, Loop Tools, and choose Circle. This will now create two circular shapes. And if we right click once more, go into Loop Tools and choose Bridge, this will create a perfect circular hole-like shape inside of a curved surface like a UV sphere. Alternatively, if you want to make an indent instead of a full hole, just select one side, use Circle again with right click, and in this case, just extrude inward like so. The third example is even more complex with a cylinder shape which doesn't have quad topology. Now, for example, this top and bottom face, which are n-gons, we can simply inset and again, right click, Loop Tools and Bridge to create a tube-like shape out of this cylinder. If we then want to add in a hole going from this surface to this surface, we need to do a few more things. Let's begin by adding in loop cuts both on the outside and on the inside and selecting all four of these edges. Now we can simply scale these on the Z-axis and move them up so we get sort of square faces wherever we want these on our cylinder shape. Now let's select one face on the outside and one face on the inside. Let's make sure these are matching up on the opposing sides, and if they are, then we're good to go. With the faces selected, let's hit I to inset it, and again choose right click and bridge to create a, in this case, square gap. Add in additional loop cuts on each individual axis. Take these two shapes here, go into Loop Tools and Circle, and we now have the geometry to actually achieve that circle look. Finally, when dealing with really complex geometry, booleans are your friend. So in this case, I have two earbuds which need to be cut out perfectly from this case shape. So let's put these inside of our case case shape and boolean these out. To do that, we'll enable an add-on called bool tool. Select one of the earbuds, shift select the case, and Control- to do a difference boolean, cutting out the earbud shape perfectly from the case. Let's repeat that with the second earbud, Control-, and you'll notice it's not doing anything, and that's because both of these booleans are using the exact solver. Change both of these to fast, and the issue should be fixed. Now I want to point out that a lot of these tips I got from you guys, and if you keep on sharing these in the comments, I can make sure to put them in next videos and share them with the community so other people can see the amazing tips that you guys have. Now, if you want to learn some more Blender tips, make sure to watch this video next.